Cool. Hi. So I'm Brandon Waldon, and today I'm excited to present work on how signers of an emerging sign language produce referring expressions. I'm first going to walk through the relevant aspects of linguistic referring expressions, in particular, the phenomenon sometimes called over-modification, but what I'll call redundant modification through the rest of this talk. By the end of this talk, I want to convince you that emergent languages provide unique test beds for evaluating theories of linguistic reference. But first, I'll acquaint you with one such language and describe its relevant properties. And since we'll be fitting computational models of referring expression production to data collected from signers of that sign language, I'll recap the key features of the models before I show you how well they actually perform. So diving right in, establishing reference to entities is a key function of natural language. So here, the small pin would do the trick of distinguishing the rightmost pin from the others. But speakers sometimes add redundant color modifiers and say things like the small blue pin. We see things in other languages, for example, in Spanish. So in this parallel case, the speaker could have just said the blue pin, but sometimes speakers add a redundant size adjective and say things like the small blue pin. So previous work on English, Dutch, and German suggests that there's an asymmetry between redundant color and size modification, with redundant color modification being much more frequent than redundant size modification. And prior work has taken patterns such as this color size asymmetry to argue for analyses whereby color and size adjectives denote concepts that differ fundamentally in their referential utility. Moreover, prior work suggests that not all languages exhibit redundant modification to the same extent, at least in the color domain. So Spanish speakers will use redundant color modification much less frequently than will English speakers. And note that the interesting thing here is that Spanish and English differ as to where adjectival modifiers occur in linear position relative to the head noun, hence our name for it, the linear order asymmetry. And prior work has taken this pattern as evidence that redundant modification is modulated by incremental production pressures. So both of these claims, which by no means are mutually exclusive, invite for further empirical investigation. So if color is a concept with higher referential utility than size, perhaps because size invokes a contextual comparison class, whereas color ostensibly does not, then we should expect the color size asymmetry to hold cross-linguistically, including in emerging languages where determiner phrase structure has not fully conventionalized. And if redundant modification is subject to incremental production pressures, then we might expect to see linear order asymmetries with modifiers beyond the color adjective domain. We might also expect that these asymmetries hold in a variety of languages that, like Spanish, tend to realize adjectival modification post rather than prenominally. So there's a unique linguistic community that offers a unique perspective on on all these questions that I just posed to you. So we'll be looking at Central Taurus Sign Language. It's an example of a village sign language, which is a sign language that emerges naturally in a small, isolated community as a result of high incidence of hereditary deafness. So CTSL arose naturally within the last half century in a remote and mountainous region in southern Turkey, in the absence of an accessible, conventionalized linguistic model. It's used in 3 neighboring villages and has approximately 30 deaf signers, most of whom use CTSL as their only language. There are also many hearing Turkish speakers who also have some degree of fluency in CTSL. So previous research on CTSL has focused primarily on finding signs for conventionalized structures. And that work in particular has explored the development of argument structure in the language. Our co-author Rabia Ergin and her collaborators previously found evidence for systematic word orders that got more conventionalized across generations of speakers. But they didn't find any evidence that CTSL has overt syntactic markers. And more recent work has found that CTSL has more variance in word order preferences, both within and across signers compared to other emerging sign languages. So most relevant for our purposes, our lead author, Leila Korshot, recently looked at phrasal structure in CTSL, in particular how signers distinguish between members of the same semantic category. And what she found is that when using modifiers, signers of CTSL prefer the head and then modifier linear sequence. She also found that when there were more complex semantic relationships between words, for example, when there was a second modifier modifying the first one, like in the English example, red-shirted man, Signers followed a dominant word order, this dominant head and then modifier order, even more strictly, which suggests that greater semantic complexity calls even more strongly for a conventional order. And this is interesting because it suggests a limited degree of conventionalization and phrasal structure in the language. So we see an emerging post-nominal modification preference, but there's still no fixed order like in English or Spanish. And this makes CTSL a very interesting testbed to study the conceptual and incremental processing constraints that govern referring expression production cross-linguistically. So to investigate how CTSL signers use language to refer, we recruited them to play a live two-player interactive reference game. In this paradigm, participants are paired with one another and assigned to either the director role or the guesser role. The director saw a display of 4 images, one of which was highlighted to indicate that it was the intended referent. The guesser saw the same display with the same images, just displayed in a different order. The director produced signs to the guesser in order to communicate a target object. Then the guesser selected an object by pointing at it. Participants received feedback at the end of each trial. And of the 4 objects in the display, 3 objects were distractor objects. And one of those 3 distractors always shared a redundant feature with the target. So in our trials, either mentioning size or mentioning color was sufficient for unique reference. This is an example of a size sufficient trial because it's sufficient to call the target here the small apple, and mentioning color would be redundant. We had 30 redundant modification trials in total. 15 were size sufficient and 15 were color sufficient. And we tested 11 pairs of CTSL signers on site in the Central Taurus region. So here's an image just to give you an appreciation of how this experiment was actually carried out. So we had experimenters sitting next to the director and the guesser, and the experimenter made a selection based on the object that the guesser was pointing at. One other really important thing that I'm going to add is that CTSL, for the most part, doesn't actually have lexicalized color signs. Signers tend to point at things in their visual field to express color, mostly to their clothes or to things in the room. So we gave them a set of colored pencils to point at during the task to reduce potential data loss. In some cases, participants could use a sign to indicate a color concept. In other cases, participants used mouthing instead of pointing at colored pencils. And if participants were mouthing something, they were typically mouthing the Turkish word for the color. So we recorded both the director and the guesser during the task. And just to give you a sense of the data, here are some examples of those recordings. So at the top, what we have is a size sufficient trial, and the target is the big red bag. And calling it the big bag would be sufficient for unique reference. So here's how this signer signs it. She signs bag and then red and then big. So she's redundantly producing color here. Sorry, and then at the bottom, what we have is a size sufficient trial. We have a color sufficient trial rather, where the target is small red pants. The signer signs it as red pants. And so he's not using redundant modification here. Okay, so on to the results. So we classified the utterances as color, size, or redundant color and size utterances. Here we have proportion of utterance on the y-axis. And these are cases in which signers were using redundant modifiers. So what we see was that there was more redundant modifier production in the size sufficient condition compared to the color sufficient condition. So that's us replicating that color size asymmetry in CTSL. We also found that modification was overwhelmingly expressed post-nominally. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Redundant modifiers were actually produced more frequently in the post-nominal position. So then we ran a second experiment with English speakers using the same paradigm. We recruited English speakers over Mechanical Turk, and we had pairs play an online version of the game where they used a chat window to communicate. So this provided a pre-nominal adjective baseline against which to interpret the results of the first experiment. So replicating previous studies, we found more redundant modification than size modification. And not surprisingly, we saw that English speakers vastly preferred pre-nominal modification to post. But despite the fact that CTSL signers overwhelmingly preferred post-nominal modification, the rates of redundant modification in CTSL were actually, if anything, slightly numerically higher than in English, contra to what we might have expected given previous comparisons of English and Spanish. So to model the behavior we observed in our CTSL signers, we considered a space of models that extend the rational speech act framework. This is a probabilistic formalism of pragmatic competence with listeners and speakers reasoning recursively about one another. So one of the canonical applications is to model listener inferences and speaker productions in referring contexts. At the base of the recursion, you have a literal listener who observes utterances and then returns a probability distribution over intended reference. And then a pragmatically competent speaker will produce utterances according to their contextual utility, where utility is formalized as a trade-off of contextual informativity for the literal listener and production cost. So in standard RSA, literal listener inferences are a function of Boolean semantic interpretation and of prior beliefs, which we assume are uniform in this context. On those assumptions, all utterances that are compatible with the object are equally informative. So in this setup, there's no reason for the speaker to redundantly mention the color property when size is sufficient, and no inherent preference given to size adjectives, color adjectives over size adjectives. So we compare that standard RSA account of the previous slide with 3 other models, which differ along 2 relevant axes. First, they differ as to whether adjectives receive a standard Boolean intersective semantics, or instead receive a continuous semantics whereby size is associated with more semantic noise than color. They also differ as to whether the speaker utility of a referring expression is computed globally for the entire utterance or incrementally at the word level. So as discussed elsewhere in the literature, standard RSA has features that make it incapable of capturing the color size asymmetry or the linear order asymmetry, but models that are continuous with their semantics have been successfully used to model the color size asymmetry, and then models that assume that speakers compute utterance utility incrementally have been used to successfully model the linear order asymmetry. So what we find for CTSL is that the model that best fits our data is a model that includes continuous semantics, but not an incremental utility mechanism. I'm happy to talk more about the details of that model comparison in the Q&A. For now, what I'll show you in yellow are the empirically observed rates of utterance production in both CTSL and English. What we see is that the predictions of the continuous model tightly track the utterance production patterns in both CTSL and English, more so than the other models that we evaluated. But it's notable that each model we tested actually has reasonable empirical coverage in this data set. I should add in the paper, we have additional support for the continuous model. We conducted a direct Bayesian model comparison of the continuous model against the other 3. So wrapping up, what we did in this project was explore how signers of an emerging sign language use their language to refer. So we showed that despite a lack of fully fledged grammatical conventions, CTSL exhibits a previously attested pattern of referring expression production, the color size asymmetry. Moreover, despite an overwhelming preference for expressing modification post-nominally, CTSL signers redundantly modify at rates similar to those observed in English. That's just qualitatively not a pattern predicted by the particular incrementalized RSA models that we considered in this project. And to further explore this result, we quantitatively evaluated 4 RSA models that differ in their commitments regarding the role of incremental pressures, relative production costs, and referential utility of items in the lexicon. And our comparison favored models with continuous semantics, but not those with an incremental utility computation mechanism. But of course, there are multiple limitations of this work. So we evaluated incremental models that baked in a specific notion of incrementality with specific assumptions regarding when speakers plan referring expressions and how they compute the referential utility of words in the lexicon. We also want to acknowledge that our 2 experiments were conducted in different modalities. So there are possibly different reference resolution strategies that obtained in each case. Right now, we're in the process of testing control groups in spoken, signed, and written language to explore the extent to which modality differences might have affected redundant modification. And in future work, we're also going to focus on collecting cross-linguistic production data across many contexts. Ones, for example, where producing the noun is itself informative, which wasn't a feature of our particular experimental design. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions.